When I was a sophomore in high school, my dad had a brand new iPad. I think it was like the version 2, and sometimes he'd let me and my brothers play video games on it. There was this game I played the crap out of called Infinity Blade, as well as its sequel, creatively titled Infinity Blade 2. And I was really excited when I learned, oh, there's a novella that's bridging the gap between the plots of these two games. And I picked that thing up for like $3 on the iBookstore. So I bought Infinity Blade Awakening, stormed right through it, had a great time. But something interesting happened for me reading that book that had never really happened to me before. Something about the writing style of this miniature fantasy story really vibed with me. I wanted more of that. But this was the first time I'd ever read something and really connected with the style to the point where that was what I wanted. I didn't want more Infinity Blade. I wanted more of whoever this guy was who wrote the Infinity Blade novella. So I plugged that author's name into the iBookstore, downloaded a sample of the first book that popped up, and I started reading. And pretty shortly afterward, I just went and purchased the whole darn book. That author's name was Brandon Sanderson, and that book's name was Mistborn: The Final Empire. Mistborn is pretty much my favorite standalone fantasy novel. I currently own 2 copies of this book because this is the book that whenever I'm telling someone you need to read a book, usually it's this one, and I'm pretty liberal about lending them out. I actually had a 3rd copy in my mass market paperback that I bought back in college, and that copy I actually ended up giving to one of Taylor's friends because they said, hey, I've been wanting to reread this book again. And I was just like, sure, take it. Besides that, I also own the ebook and the audiobook on 2 different storefronts. I have spent way more money on this one book than was probably intended. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that this book really changed and shaped the way that I read books. Mistborn was one reading more from a scholastic activity or something I enjoyed tangentially because of some relation to something I already liked, like movie or video game tie-ins, to something that I just enjoyed on its own. It was the first time I picked up a book, a big fantasy book for that matter, without any external or media direction telling me this is what you should read, and I just sat down and read it. And because of that, it's got a special place in my heart. When I got my first paycheck from my job in college, the first thing I did is I went over to the Barnes & Noble bookstore, which was so gloriously close to our campus, and I went and bought every book I could find on their shelf that took place in Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere setting, and it was money well spent, although groceries were a little bit tight that month. If you can't tell, I'm a bit of a Sanderson fanboy. For that reason, I wanted to hold off on making a video about the Mistborn series until I was a little bit more comfortable making videos about books, or just making videos in general. But then I remembered the next book in the second era of Mistborn is coming out later this month, so I decided now might be a good time to reread the books and document my progress. Now, it's likely that I may very well come back and redo videos like these, pull the classic YouTuber gambit of, I don't care for my video on X topic anymore, but that's gonna be a ways off. But in the meantime, I'm happy to talk about these. But that said, let's take a look at one of my favorite books ever, Mistborn: The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. Welcome back to the bookcase. So some clarification, Mistborn is the name of the series, and The Final Empire, you might see it in tiny text there, is the name of the book. I've seen the first book referred to interchangeably as both, so I'm probably going to refer to it as both. Mistborn is described by its author as a story whose conception point is, what would happen if the Dark Lord in any given fantasy story won, and what does the world look like down the line? Now that's the conception point, but I can see it having branched off from that as time went on. As far as reading flavor goes, I would put it sort of at the halfway point between literature directed at young adults and something beefier in the modern fantasy genre like Game of Thrones. It has an edge and weight to it that sets it apart from most young adult-oriented stuff, both in tone and content, but it feels a bit more accessible, I think, than most modern high fantasy outings. My elevator pitch for this book is high fantasy meets Ocean's 11 meets My Fair Lady. It's a fantasy story with a heisty flavor that also has a subplot about a street urchin learning to blend in with high society. For heisty reasons. If that's enough for you to read it, go do that. I cannot recommend this book enough. It's a very fun experience to go into blind. So what's this book about? In a world where ash falls from the sky, sprayed up by volcanic mounts, and all-encompassing mists obscure every night, the Lord Ruler is the god and rules all. See, in this world, God is a guy, and you can go up, and he's just sitting there. He exists, he's immortal, and he rules the world with an iron fist. The church says the Lord Ruler thousands of years ago saved the world from an unspeakable disaster and went on to take over the world. In the aftermath, we largely see the people of the world split into two groups: the nobility, whose ancestors supported the Lord Ruler in his bid for power, and the Ska, the descendants of the people who opposed the Lord Ruler. Being Ska is not a good time. Odds are you're either plantation Ska, working long and demanding hours, beatings are frequent, and death is pretty inevitable, or you're city Ska. Your odds are slightly better, but you're still working for scraps and your life could be forfeit at any moment, whether from bad luck or some interpreted infraction from the nobility. We follow Vin, a member of a Ska thieving crew, that is, a group of Ska who have made it their profession to scam nobles out of their coin, a very dangerous but lucrative profession. Vin is no master thief, though. Abandoned by her brother and indebted to her uncaring and abusive crew leader, Vin survives by making herself as unremarkable as possible and trusting no one. So she's tough, untrusting, and reserved. Things change when Vin is swept into a new crew who tell her that she is something unique, a Mistborn. Someone able to use the unique magic of this world, Alomancy, to its fullest. Vin's new crew have taken on an enormous job. Led by their charismatic Mistborn leader Kelsier, the crew plans to dismantle the final empire so they can rob its husk blind. Vin's role will be a central one, but to play it, she'll have to break out of her shell and maybe learn to trust her crew members along the way. Here is opportunity number 2 to jump off if that at all sounds enticing. I have deliberately tried not to say anything past the first part of the book thus far. I think one of Sanderson's strongest points as an author is his world building, and one of the joys of Mistborn is learning about the world of Mistborn gradually as Sanderson reveals it to us. It's a bit difficult to talk about the rest of those elements without revealing them. I wouldn't necessarily call these spoilers, but again, the process for this one, the joy, is going to be in the learning here. You can still watch this video and thoroughly enjoy the book. I just personally believe that this is a very fun blind read. In fact, I'll just say this up front, I would say that Mistborn is probably the best book to read if you've been wanting to get into fantasy, but just have been looking for a gateway to get into the genre. This is the one I recommend. So if I've persuaded you, pretend this is the end of the video. Like, comment, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff, go have fun reading something. Specifically, go have fun reading this something. But for those of you who stuck around, let's go on with the show. I really love the world that this book takes place in. One of the strongest aspects of Mistborn is just the interconnected nature of its world. What the setting lacks in breadth, it more than makes up for in depth. See, it's difficult to explain any one aspect of Mistborn without needing to get into every other aspect of Mistborn. You can explain the plight of the Ska from their own point of view easily enough, but if you're going to try to explain the nobility, that means you're going to have to talk about by what mandate and authority that they rule by, which means you're going to have to talk about the Steel Ministry. If you're going to explain the Steel Ministry, then you're also going to have to explain why it oversees the nobility, which means you're also going to have to talk about Alomancy. And if you're going to talk about Alomancy and the Steel Ministry, you're also going to have to bring up the rules about relations between nobility and Ska, and just why being a half-breed in this world is such a problem, which is also going to bring it into talking about Ska thieving crews. And if we're going to talk about Ska thieving crews, that's going to bring us right back to the nobility, who they're stealing from. There aren't a ton of elements at play in this book, but they all have very clearly defined relationships which feed back into each other. It's all very tightly constructed. I've also got to say, I really like the magic of this world, as long as we're talking about things that are tightly defined. Sanderson is well known as an author for his magic systems, especially his hard magic systems. That is, a magic system whose rules are more rigid and structured. Mistborn's big system is Alomancy, so let's give a brief primer on that. Alomancers are the ability to ingest a certain metal and then burn that metal in their stomach for a corresponding ability to that metal. There are 8 basic allomantic metals which each provide a different allomantic ability. These range from subtle things like manipulating a person's emotions to more overt things like enhancing your own strength or physical senses. Most allomancers are what we call mistings. A misting is someone who can burn 1 allomantic metal. Now, to clarify, that is not they can burn 1 metal at a time, they can burn 1 of the basic allomantic metals. So a pewter arm can only burn pewter to enhance his physical strength, and a tin eye can only burn tin to enhance their senses. A few allomancers are what we call Mistborn, though. These are allomancers who have the ability to burn every allomantic metal. Most interestingly, they can burn steel and iron, whose abilities allow them to push and pull on metal objects around them. This makes Mistborn super cool because of how they can use those 2 powers together. Now, this isn't like Magneto, where you've got like telekinesis with metal objects. It is only pushing and pulling, and that always needs to happen with your own weight. So you can't move something heavier than you. If you push on something heavier than you, you will move yourself away, and if you pull on something heavier than you, you'll pull yourself towards it. The same for something lighter than yourself. If you push on something lighter, it will move away from you until it can't move anymore, and if you pull on something lighter, it will then move toward you. The way Mistborn use this ability is they fling themselves across the city's rooftops. Basically, you drop a coin on the pavement, push on that coin with your allomantic abilities, and then you're flying through the air, or rather, you are falling with style. With a lot of practice and the minute corrections that can be made by pulling on metal objects around the rooftops of the city, Mistborn effectively become known for soaring through the mists in the night. Also, a coin being launched with your full weight behind it makes a pretty deadly projectile. Now, this isn't exclusive to Mistborn. Allomancers who can just burn steel and push can do that too, but it's still cool. With these abilities, Mistborn are most well known for being assassin, daggers in the night whenever one noble house needs someone else to die. The big thing that makes Alomancy so fun is just how consistent it is. Sanderson likes the people of his worlds to take his magic systems and hammer them down into a science. With Sanderson, magic is usually not just magic, it's a part of the natural world that the people living in this world have learned about and studied. As with science, there are sometimes things that may need to be revised, or things we don't understand yet, or even just things that we might assume are correct, but then later learn are not the way that things work. I don't think it's controversial to say that out of all of the magic systems that Sanderson has come up with, Alomancy is probably the most scientific of them. Alomancy isn't the only magic in this world, however. There are other forces which are just as, if not more, impressive. But I'm going to hold off on that because that's getting a little bit into spoiler territory, not quite where I want to go with this review. All that said about the setting, though, I should probably talk about the characters in this character-driven story. The characters are all very good, but there's 2 that we're going to be most focused on in this story. Those are going to be Vin and Kelsier, our primary and secondary protagonists. There are other characters, but these 2 are unquestionably our most important characters, and they are the ones who we are going to spend most of the book with their points of view. Broadly broken down, we have Vin, our primary protagonist, who is the crew's newest member, and Kelsier, the secondary protagonist, is the leader of the crew. Starting with Vin, she is, as I said, our primary point of view, and she's a very fun one. She's definitely what I would call the most young adult novel thing about this book, but I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. Actually, I think it's part of what makes her so fun. When we first meet Vin, she's a tough young thing. She's learned to survive by picking her battles and trusting nobody. She's beaten down, she's abused, but she's determined. And then, of course, she ends up meeting with the crew, and things hit off from there. Now, what makes her fun on the crew is that Vin is the most hilariously untrusting person in the world. She firmly believes that everyone is out for themselves, and given time, anybody will betray you. She's actually so traumatized by her abusive upbringing under her brother that she still hears his voice in her head telling her, "Everyone will betray you, Vin. Everyone." Part of the reason she chooses to join the crew for this job is because of the camaraderie she sees between the members of this crew. She has to know if it's real or not. Besides this, Vin is also a weird little gremlin person. She's lived her whole life on the streets, and she's a bit of a tomboy for it. Honestly, if you're going to be living on the streets and slumming it up with the dregs of society, yeah, that's probably going to be a little bit safer. She is the kind of person who picks a seat in a room based on whether or not she can see everyone in the room and if it puts her back to anybody. She's also the kind of person who is intimately familiar with the fact that out on the street, you don't know where your next meal is coming from. So if she's getting free food, you can bet she is stuffing her pockets with it. So with that in mind, Vin is perfect for the role of impersonating a noble so that she can attend high society balls and keep tabs on the nobility during this job. This was, to me, one of the most enjoyable parts of the book, the My Fair Lady portion. Vin has to learn to fit in with the upper crust enough that she can pull the wool over their eyes and do her part for the con. Overall, Vin's arc in this story is one I enjoy a lot. Her whole thing is about trusting people and learning to be vulnerable. It's an appealing character arc. It's about watching her come out of her shell and figure out who she really is. In particular, and this is speaking from knowledge that I have from having read the rest of the books in the series, she's still, when all is said and done, a weird little gremlin person. And I like that. It's just now she's a weird little gremlin person who knows herself just a little bit better. Then there's Kelsier. Kelsier is our secondary protagonist, and he's more traditional for the leading role man in these kinds of stories. He is the brash and charismatic leader of a band of thieves. I want to lead with this up front. Kelsier is a power fantasy. He's smart. He's the mastermind of the plan. He's suave. He's the kind of guy who can get everyone's eyes in a room on him, for better or for worse. He's strong. He's the crew's other Mistborn and more experienced by far than Vin. And to top it all off, he's got a tragic backstory, which is to say he's interesting. He's a guy who interesting things happen to. And for the power fantasy, it helps that all the bad things happened in the past anyway, so it's fine. It's fine. None of this makes Kelsier a bad character. In fact, I would say he's a great character. The real genius of Kelsier and characters like him is it allows Sanderson to have his cake and eat it too. We have an in-focus protagonist, Vin, who is less experienced, has more room to grow, and has a lot that she needs to do. And then we have our secondary protagonist, Kelsier, who is already all of the things that Vin needs to become, even though he's got some growing to do too. There is more to him than just being wish fulfillment, though. He's also the primary instigator of the plot, and often we, the reader, may see what he's doing, but we might not know what he's planning. Moreover, Kelsier is not exactly what I would call a merciful soul. Kelsier's tragic backstory means he has it out for the Lord Ruler. Kelsier has a plan, or at least the shape of a plan, to kill the Lord Ruler, and he's not shy about voicing that when they're putting together their heist. His bloodlust does not stop at the Lord Ruler, though. Kelsier is of the mind that the only good noble is a dead noble. But nobles also have guards, ska guards, who honestly are just people trying to feed their families, but as far as Kelsier's concerned, they forfeited their lives when they threw their lot in with the nobility. All of this is to say that despite all of the things to love about Kelsier, he has a mean, dark streak to him, and that does a lot for making him a more interesting character who has to do some growing in this story. Besides that, he's also prone to doing some shady stuff in this story that might make the reader uncomfortable. In particular, the way he sets himself up with the army that they are building for the Ska Rebellion in this story. I won't say more than that, but I will say it's very clear to me that the book agrees that this is shady, the thing that he is doing. It is making everybody uncomfortable who sees what's going on. All of this to say is Kelsier is a very fun character and a very good protagonist to serve in that secondary role. He's a lot of people's favorite character, and I don't think that's invalid at all. Now, he used to be my favorite character, but as time has gone on, I have come to like Vin more, but I still appreciate him a whole lot. Of course, we spend most of our time with these two, but there are other members of our crew to get to know. The other crew members do contribute, but I will say they're not nearly as important to the story as Kelsier and Vin are, although I will say I am a big fan specifically of Breeze and Ham in this story. Ham is the security guy who likes to ask complicated questions, and Breeze is a foppish manipulator whose emotional alomancy makes him an excellent grifter. He also doesn't particularly like to answer Ham's complicated questions, so the two get on like cats and dogs. It's a dynamic which I very much enjoy. The crew doesn't really get as much time to shine in this book as Kelsier and Vin do, but they still make excellent supporting characters in their own right, and the book would definitely be lesser if they were not in it. Now, there are a few more important characters to talk about, starting with Sazed. Sazed is a Terraceman steward serving in Kelsier's employ as Vin's assistant and protector for the time being. The Terracemen are a race of people who are facing a great deal of oppression in their own right. The Terrace people have been subjugated and placed in breeding programs by the Lord Ruler, effectively to make docile servants out of them. Now, while Sazed shows an attitude consistent with that upbringing, he is also something of a rebel himself. He is part of a group of Terraceman scholars called the Keepers, them being a group whose role is to keep all of the knowledge from before the rise of the Final Empire until such a time as the Final Empire is toppled and that knowledge can be given back to the people. Sazed's specialty is pre-imperial religions. He'll often tell someone about an old society's beliefs and offer the religion up to them as a good fit. Sazed's good people. I like him a lot, and he's got a lot riding on his shoulders that he handles like a champ. A lot of that is the shady programming, but he's learned to handle it and deal with everything in a very subtle way that's very amusing to watch. I will say he's not super important in this book. He does do some important things, but I mostly bring him up because he's going to be a big player later down the line. Lastly, we have Elend. Elend is the noble heir of the greatest of the great houses in Luthadel, the capital, and Vin meets him at her first ball. Elend serves as a love interest for Vin, and I can see some people not liking how Vin just kind of falls for this boring guy, but I think maybe that's part of why she falls for him. See, Elend is just kind of normal. He's young and an idealist. He's got strong opinions about the way the government is run and what could be done to fix it. He's also young and an idealist. He has no idea just how impossible the world is to fix completely with just ideas. He's also a product of the society he's grown up in. He's certainly better than many nobles, but he's still grown up in a culture which views the Ska as lesser to a significant degree. But he's also a reader of forbidden books, the kind that would get a person in trouble if they were found with those books by the Steel Ministry. Books that describe the inevitability of rebellion by the Ska and what's going to happen to the nobles when that rebellion happens. More than anything else, Elend is straightforward. He's a bit foppish, but when he speaks with Vin, he doesn't really have an angle, and I think that's what she likes about him. I'll have a bit more to say about Elend in a bit, but I do like him for the most part. He's an important part of Vin's coming out of her shell story, though I can definitely see why some people do not like him, particularly why they don't like him in this book. Overall, this book has a strong cast, and I don't think there's a bad character among the lot. Everyone's doing something for the story, and they're all making it better. With all this, I also want to talk about the flavor of the book that I briefly mentioned at the beginning here. Mistborn is a fantasy story, but it also has a healthy tinge of heist flavor to it, and I love the way that that works with the overall narrative. I'll be the first to admit that I wish there was a little bit more heist stuff going on throughout the book, but even when it's not happening, it still lends to what the characters are doing. We're always looking at someone pulling a con, even when that's not exactly what they're doing. In a way, I'd say that what they're doing has less in common with a heist story and more in common with an espionage thriller. There's spies, assassins in the night, imposters in court, all that stuff. I'll probably have more to say later about how much more heist I would have liked to see in this, but I think it's worth noting that the nature of our protagonists and what they're trying to pull here makes the political intrigue a whole lot more intriguing. I guess we should also mention the writing. I've previously said that I think Brandon Sanderson's big secret to success is just how accessible and consumable his writing is, and I think that holds true here as well. Mistborn reads easily. Earlier I compared it to the halfway point between young adult stuff and more demanding, thicker high fantasy stuff like Game of Thrones. Sanderson's prose is just descriptive enough to paint a haunting picture of the setting, but it's also snappy and straightforward enough to always keep that momentum of forward movement in the story. It keeps your eyes moving down the page, interested in what's going to be said next. It doesn't feel insubstantial like some things do, but it's also much, much easier to read than most high fantasy novels I've tried. As for the dialogue, back when I was talking about the Legion novellas, also by Sanderson, I talked about how the wittiness of the characters I found to be a bit much at times. The Whedonisms, if you will. Here, I think it works a bit better. For one, a longer book means more time to flesh out characters, which means those moments where everybody's hyper-witty are fewer and far between. It doesn't make up the bulk of the dialogue. I do think there's something to witty dialogue like that. I just think it needs to be part of a larger whole. When that's all that there is, sometimes your characters cease to sound like people. I'd also say the kinds of characters we're working with are more attuned to that kind of wittiness. Kelsier and Doxson are old friends who have been living it up scamming nobles for most of their lives, and they're kind of posh in a Novo-Rich sort of way. Then you've got someone like Breeze, who strikes me unironically as the kind of person who talks like this. The witticisms are not the entirety of the dialogue here, they're just a part of it, and they're an important part that makes us grasp how much these characters like each other. Lastly, I want to appreciate the action scenes in this book. A lot of what makes these action scenes tick is the firm definition of Alomancy in this series. In particular, a fight involving Mistborn is always fun to read. We really get to visualize the intricacies of how pushing and pulling on the metals around them affects the fight. Then there's fights between a Mistborn and another Mistborn. Here you've got people who have virtually the same power set to push and pull on metals, as well as burn pewter to enhance their physical abilities, and they're also probably going to be trying to push and pull on the metal on the other person, which usually is just going to be their coin pouch, which serves as ammunition. But then there's Atium. Atium is the super valuable metal in this world that, when burned by a Mistborn, allows them to see just a few moments into the future, and to react to what people are doing before they've even decided to do it. A Mistborn burning Atium is effectively unkillable. In a battle between two Mistborn, the one who has more Atium is usually going to be the winner, because the only effective way to counter a Mistborn with Atium is to be Mistborn and to have Atium to burn yourself. A quote from an old Sonic the Hedgehog movie that I think sums it up nicely.
You might know everything I'm going to do, but that's not going to help you, since I know everything you're going to do. Strange, isn't it?
Atium lets you fight someone else burning Atium on equal footing. But if someone runs out of Atium, then they are de facto the loser. This adds a sense of tension to the fight, where there's a clock slowly counting down. There's only really one fight in the book that takes great advantage of this, but I still think it's worth mentioning. All of this is to say that the action in this book is very satisfying. There weren't very many times where I was reading something that was happening here and was trying to figure out exactly what was going on, and I really think, again, it's because the rules of Alomancy are so firmly defined, you can kind of logically put together what's going to be happening and what things are going to look like just based on those rules. Now, taking a step back to everything, I do have some criticisms for this book. If I had to summarize all of my criticisms in one, it's just that there's just not enough of this first book. That's not saying that I think it needs to be longer. I think it's plenty long already, although I probably wouldn't be mad if it was longer. The issue is that there's a lot of things that have implications in this book. We're told something exists, or that something is happening, or that something will happen with the plan, and we just kind of have to take it for granted. I think part of the issue here is that these books were written by Brandon Sanderson more or less all at once. So I think one of the things that you occasionally run into in this trilogy is things popping up in one book that don't feel like they make a ton of sense in that book individually, but then make more sense if we're looking at the entire trilogy as a whole. But I'm also of the opinion that even individual installments in the trilogy should be able to hold up on their own, and things should have a purpose for why they're there, although there are some allowances that can be made. For the most part, I think Mistborn does well with this, but occasionally we run into bits like that where we're just looking at things that you wonder, is that really important? The answer is yes, it is important, just not yet, not in this book. On that topic, another thing I just wish there was more of is those heist elements. Again, this book, the events are more akin to an espionage thriller, but I just wish there was more actual heist going on. The point of the story is, of course, these are thieves and criminals, and they're the only people with the skills and connections necessary to make what needs to happen happen. Yes, they're more like nobles than they are like Ska, but that's exactly why they have the ability to make a difference. I just wish there was less, we need to build an army, and more, we need to put together this intricate plan to steal this valuable thing right out from someone's nose. Another thing I wish there was more of is just the high society stuff that Vin has to deal with. There's a decent number of balls that Vin attends through the book, but it feels like there could have been more, and we could have gotten a bigger picture of her progress as she goes to these parties. I honestly really like this element of the story a lot, and I wish there could have been more of it. That brings me to something else I want to come back to, Elend. I want to reiterate, I like Elend as a character a lot, especially knowing where his character goes later. I think the big thing that brings it down for me is just, Vin is so untrusting by her nature. It feels really weird to me how she and Elend meet at a ball, and how quickly Vin just sort of ends up enjoying his company, because that just kind of feels a little out of character for her. Again, I can jump logical hoops in circles to justify it, and I like the way it turns out. I really like Vin and Elend for each other. I think they're really great characters in that regard. I also just have trouble with how quickly Vin comes around to Elend. He isn't exactly the first handsome face that she runs across at court, but he's close to it. It feels weird for her character. All of this said, this is still close to, if not just straight up, my favorite fantasy book ever. And looking back on it, I can see a lot of the messiness in it a lot more clearly than I used to, but this whole book is still very much a win for me. It's just, Mistborn is such a good book, man. It's by no means perfect, and I'll definitely have some things to say about the other two books in this trilogy, but Mistborn is what I believe to be the best standalone fantasy book that you could pick up if you're wanting to get into fantasy. If you are already into fantasy, it's still a great book to read. This book means a lot to me, which is why I want to do it justice, and why someday in the distant future, if and when I ever get more comfortable with creating content, if we're still doing this YouTube thing a few years down the line, I will probably come back and look at this book again to talk about just how much it means to me. Even though there are some minor hiccups, I consider this book to be one of the greats, and I hope you might take the chance to pick it up and see why I think that. Big thanks again for sticking around if you did. I realize this is probably a little chunky, or I won't know if this is the longest thing I've put together until I edit it, but we'll see. If you're still here, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a subscribe. For today's question, tell me, what is one book that makes you insufferable because you won't stop recommending it to people to the point where they tell you to leave their house? Because for me, it's this one. At any rate, I'm Steven. This is The Bookcase. Go have fun reading something.